Fantastic, thanks very much. Thanks very much everyone for coming along. So this topic's a little bit outside my usual kind of wheelhouse. In some ways I'm an epistemologist, mainly though in trying perhaps vainly, but perhaps gradually to kind of work in ethics. But this talk actually, although it is in ethics, did come out of sort of some work in epistemology. So I was working on questions about kind of aggregating, I was just saying this to Nick earlier actually, but aggregating probabilities in kind of social epistemology situations. You've got a group of individuals who've each got their own kind of sets of probabilities. You want to kind of figure out what the group's probabilities are. There's lots of different ways of doing this. You can do a kind of standard arithmetic averaging of it, you can do geometric averaging, you can do much fancier things than that. There's a question about what you should do. And I was kind of interested in that question and kind of came up with some arguments for doing that. And I thought, oh, hang on, it's sort of interesting that in welfare ethics you get a similar-ish sort of problem where you've got individuals. In this case, they don't have kind of probabilities over states, but they have something more like sort of utilities over states. But again, you know, you might think that some positions in welfare ethics are attempts to provide something like the group's kind of welfare level based on the individual's welfare level. And you might think that utilitarianism, prioritarianism, versions of those are some sort of attempt to do something like that. Perhaps something like the same sorts of arguments that worked in the probabilities case could work over here. And it turned out, rather to my surprise, I have to say that that something like that, exactly that does happen. So that's kind of where this is coming from. But I'm not going to talk about the kind of probabilities side really at all. I'll just talk about the kind of welfare ethics application of these ideas. But if anyone's interested, I mean, I did put some slides at the end about the epistemology side, just in case, you know, people were unable to keep their kind of epistemic questions to themselves. Happy to talk about them. Okay, so I want to talk about really a way of telling between different positions in what you might think of as kind of welfarist moral axiology. So what does that mean? So moral axiology, sort of question about the kind of morally relevant value of a state of the world. So we're thinking about states of the world, there's some sort of maximally specific sort of description of a way that things could be. And in many areas, particularly say of consequentialism or something like that in ethics, you want to assign a value to those states of the world. But of course, that particular states of the world will have lots of different components to its value. It might have some aesthetic value. If you're someone like me, you might think that it has kind of epistemic value, something to do with the kind of amount of sort of accurate beliefs that people have in that state. So the idea is there's some components of the state of the world that it's kind of morally relevant value. And when we're doing kind of moral decision making, it's something like that that we're perhaps trying to maximize if we're consequentialists, or kind of promote to a certain degree if we're satisficers or something like that. So yeah, the idea is that lots of different sort of theories about morally right action depend in some way on a notion of moral axiology, the idea of some sort of morally relevant value that a state of the world can have. And you might be a welfarist. Welfarists roughly say something like, well, the morally relevant value of a state of the world is a function only of the levels of welfare enjoyed by the morally relevant individuals that exist in that world. Where the morally relevant individuals, for some people, might be all the humans, they might be all the sentient beings, they might be all the intelligent beings, or beings that can form plans and reflect on them, whatever you like. I'm not going to take a stand on any of that here. But welfarism is something like, in order to give this kind of morally relevant value for a state of the world, which is then going to get plugged into your moral theory of right action, you're going to need some function that takes the different levels of welfare that individuals have at the state of the world and give back some sort of value for that. I'm going to do a lot of kind of simplifying, partly because this is a shortish talk and partly because I'm not sure exactly how the arguments I'm giving here are going to apply in the more general case. But the main kind of the headline kind of assumption I'm just going to make is what's sometimes called the fixed population assumption in this case. I'm going to be interested just in cases where all of the different states of the world that we're interested in have the same morally relevant individuals in them. This is clearly a very restricted part of kind of ethical theorizing, because quite often the ethical decisions we have to make are choosing between different prospects which give different probabilities to states of the world that include different individuals. But there's all sorts of kind of problems that arise there for most moral axiologies that get discussed in the kind of population ethics debate. I'm not going to get into those. But it's a kind of interesting question whether the stuff that I'm talking about here is going to be applicable in a variable population case. If it's not, that might be an argument that can just isn't a starter to begin with. But I'm not going to really talk about that. We can discuss if people are interested. I'm also going to assume there's going to be finitely many morally relevant individuals. Infinite population ethics is now very much a big concern, but I'm not going to be interested in it. There's no real, in principle, problem with extending the stuff I'm talking about here to that case. I'm just not going to talk about it. It mathematically becomes a lot more complex. And then this final assumption, which is very clearly a big assumption, but just one that I'm going to make again in the interest of time, is that for any individual in any state of the world, just going to assume that there's some numerical value that records their kind of level of welfare at that state of the world. And in such a way that you can kind of naturally compare those between two individuals. If this individual's number is higher than that individual's number, then they are genuinely better off than this other individual. So we're assuming things about kind of interpersonal utility comparisons, which many people don't want to allow, but...
So can I,
yes.
Just to clarify, so that you're using some sort of really cardinal interpersonal, the full...
That's right, the full bag, yeah, okay. Absolutely, that's right, yeah. So that's why it's kind of a strong assumption. We'll see later on why that's kind of necessary for the approach. I think there's again, an interesting question about whether you can take something like the kind of broad brushstrokes of this approach and then apply it in a case where you're not assuming something like that. But I don't think there's any in principle reason you can't, but you won't get the kind of very, or at least without a lot more work, you won't get the kind of clean results that I'll get here.
It's also a small clarification. So is an individual's welfare level at a world something that's fixed by the properties of that world alone?
Yes. Yes.
By assumption.
By assumption. Yes, that's right. Maybe we can come back to whether that's going to be a problem later on. I can't think now what would happen if you lifted that for this case, but maybe we can come back. Okay, so here are three welfare axiologies that are welfarist axiologies that are discussed, and they're going to be the ones that I'm going to try to sort of distinguish between with the argument I'm interested in. So we're just going to, so as I say, we're assuming there's just a fixed population, so M individuals going to represent a state of the world because we're welfarists just by the levels of welfare that those M individuals have at that state of the world, so just by a vector like that. So that UI is just the individual I's level of welfare at that state. So utilitarianism, this is in fact average utilitarianism, but that, given we're in a fixed population situation, that doesn't particularly matter. So utilitarianism, we just add up the levels of welfare, and average utilitarianism, we take the average of them. Prioritarianism, this is again average prioritarianism, again because it's fixed population, that doesn't make any difference. We'll hopefully become a bit clearer later on why I've gone for those, given that it doesn't make a difference. So in that case, what you do, instead of just adding up the levels of welfare, is you add up the distorted levels of welfare, where you take someone's level of welfare and then you distort it by a strictly increasing concave function. So the idea is something like, if you have a situation in which one person is kind of doing, a lot better than another person, you make a transfer between the person that's doing better to the person that's doing less well that retains that ordering between them. The amount by which the contribution to welfare of the better off individual reduces by taking that amount off them is less than the amount that you increase the contribution to welfare of the worse off person by giving them that amount. In a utilitarian case, it's exactly the same amount that you reduce the better off person that you then increase the worse off person's contribution by. In the prioritarian case, because you're doing a concave function of these welfares, the amount that you reduce the better off person by, the contribution that they make by is less than the amount that the worse off person gets better by. So this is, I mean, philosophers like to attribute this to Derek Parfit's Lindley lectures in the 90s, but it's actually much older. It's actually much older even in philosophy, but it's certainly a lot older in economics. Parfit doesn't give a particularly formal account of it. The kind of more recent formal accounts I'll talk a little bit about. And then expected equally distributed equivalent, so sort of takes this average prioritarian value for state of the world and transforms it back again by using the inverse of that strictly increasing concave function. Why do that? You might think, well, here's one natural way to put it. Suppose we are the fixed population of the world, very small world, it's just us, and every single one of us has exactly the same welfare level. Then you might naturally think that the welfare level of that world, or the morally relevant value of that world, should just be that level of welfare, whatever it is. That's what this guarantees. The point is that it's going to make a difference in decisions under uncertainty. Okay, it's not going to make much difference. It's not going to make a difference to ordering, because this is strictly increasing functions. You're just going to get the same ordering between worlds, but it's going to make a difference when it comes to doing expected value calculations. And you want it to be the case that, say, there was just one person at a world, and they were making a choice between two uncertain prospects. Then you want it to be the case that their prudential decision that they make by maximizing their expected welfare should be the same decision as you would make by maximizing the expected morally relevant value, and you only get that if you do this. So that's a kind of natural justification for that.
You have a hand from online.
Oh, sorry, yes, Alex.
Oh, thank you. Hi, sorry not to be there in person.
No worries.
This is just a clarifying question. Why are you calling it the expected equally distributed equivalent when everything you've explained and also have on the slide is simply about outcomes? I mean, I know it's relevant, as you correctly said, in cases of expectation, but in this instance, aren't we just talking about the equally distributed equivalent rather than any expectation?
Yeah, sorry, that's right. That's right. That should be equally distributed. Yeah. So the expect. Yeah. So we're not applying these to. This is. I'll talk about this a little bit at the end. We're doing this ex post at the moment. So these distortions get applied to the welfare levels rather than the expected welfare levels. Yeah. Okay. So how do people argue for, or how do people tell between these? I mean, of course, you've got to perhaps argue for your welfarism in the first place, and so on. But here's the standard sort of argument is a sort of representation theorem style of argument. So you assume that you've got an ordering of states of the world by their kind of morally relevant value, and you put some hopefully natural seeming conditions on that ordering, and then you show that in fact it's going to be ordering these states by either the utilitarian value of them or the prioritarian value of them. Okay, so here are some natural axioms that people might use to characterize this. So Pareto indifference just says that if you've got two states of the world and for each individual their level of welfare is the same at each of the two worlds, then they're morally have the same value, have the same morally relevant value. In some ways you might think that's sort of just an automatic commitment to welfarism. You're not a welfarist if you think that, if that's wrong. Similarly, you might think this of strong Pareto. This just says if you've got two states of the world and for each individual, they're doing at least as well at one world as they are, the first world as they are at the second, and some individuals are doing better than the first world is better from a moral point of view. Again, you might think that's kind of just automatic for welfarism. Similarly with anonymity, which just says that it's not the individuals, the individual to which a level of welfare attaches should not matter, but just the profile of levels of welfare that matter. So if you've got two situations and they have exactly the same levels of welfare but just permuted over the individuals, then they should be should have the same morally relevant value. Then continuity, which is just in some ways a sort of technical. I mean, I think it has some natural intuitive plausibility, but in some ways it's a technical assumption. Just as if you've got one world better than another, then there's some region around the levels of welfare ascribed in the first world, such that if you remain within that small region, then you remain better than the second world. Just means that kind of small deviations from the welfare levels of the first world will also give you a world that's better. You don't, it's a standard continuity axiom. Okay, and then separability, kind of very standard axiom in this sort of situation. Probably best, if people aren't familiar with it already, to look at it just in a particular example. So if you look at this, we've got 4 different worlds, u, v, u prime, and v prime. You're wanting to compare u and v and u prime and v prime. And you notice that between u and v, individuals 2 and 3, the second and third individuals, yes, individuals 2 and 3, are unaffected by the choice. They have exactly the same welfare levels at the 2 of them. And so separability is meant to say something like, in that situation, the ordering of u and v should be a function only of the welfare levels of the individuals who are affected by them, where their welfare levels are going to be different between the 2 of them. What do you mean by function of? What does it mean to say that the ordering is a function only of that? Well, it's meant to be something like this. If you move to a case that's similar in that individuals 2 and 3 are unaffected by it, and if you look at the remaining individuals that are affected by it, they're in exactly the same position as they were with respect to these 2, then you should order these 2 in exactly the same way that you should order these 2. So, standard separability assumption. Okay, so those together, very standard result in this area, those together, the ones that we've talked about so far, are going to give this kind of representation. Your morally relevant ordering will say that u is at least as good, that v is at least as good as u if the sum of distorted, I'm going to say distorted here, distorted welfare levels of from v is at least as high as the sum of the distorted welfare levels in u, where in fact f may not be a distortion at all, it could be the identity function, but it's going to be some sort of continuous strictly increasing function that gives those. So that's your kind of standard separability representation theorem. And then how do you distinguish utilitarianism and prioritarianism from from among these orderings? Well, the way to kind of identify the prioritarian ones is by this Pettigrew-Dalton axiom, which essentially is the one that I mentioned a little earlier when I was describing prioritarianism, which is sometimes put by saying progressive transfers improve states of the world, morally speaking. So that means if you've got a situation, 2 states of the world where they only differ in the welfare levels of 2 individuals, first individual is worse off than the second one, and to move to the other state of the world, you reduce the first one by a certain amount that you then increase the worst off one by that amount, and they retain their ordering, then that's a progressive transfer. You've removed some welfare from a better off person and given it to a worse off person that's retained their ordering. Then the progressive transfers improved things to the second state of the world is morally better. Okay, so that's just what that says. So that's Pettigrew-Dalton. In some ways it's the defining feature of prioritarianism, is exactly the thing that prioritarianism was designed to kind of give us. I won't go into if people are interested, go into the history, but the kind of motivation behind prioritarianism is to essentially give something like this property without being egalitarian. When I say original motivation. In philosophy, as I said, Parfit gets credited with this. It was Parfit's motivations spelling this out. as to how to recover that feature of a moral axiology without being egalitarian, because he thought there were all these sorts of reasons for not being egalitarian, and these kind of levelling down objections and so on. So he thought there was something right in the intuition behind egalitarianism. There was something better about these kind of, improving about these kind of transfers. But what it was that made it better wasn't that they became more equal as a result. It was that the worst off's lot were improved, and only at the detriment of the better off, and that's what prioritarianism was sort of trying to recover. And it was kind of an insight that that was possible to do while avoiding the levelling down objection to egalitarianism. Okay, okay, so that's so much kind of background and history. Now on to some wild arguments. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple of arguments now, rather sort of briefly, that point towards a particular way of calculating the kind of morally relevant value of a state of the world. They're to some extent different. They certainly come from very different traditions, and in the end point towards a similar sort of principle by which you would calculate this morally relevant value. And then I'm going to suggest a way of formalizing that and show that it in fact allows us to tell between utilitarianism and these equally distributed equivalents of prioritarianism. Okay. So the first one I'm kind of drawing, and I'm hesitant to suggest this here, and also in LSE, I've got to make clear that it's rule contractualism rather than act contractualism I'm talking about, but I sort of draw in some ways on some of the ideas behind contractualism, but go in a very different direction from the way that Scanlon wants to go with it. Okay, so here's the kind of beginning principle from contractualism that Scanlon wants to give, and then he kind of fleshes it out by building in lots of extra things and ends up with a kind of non-aggregative theory that he proposes. I'm going to go in a different direction. So here's the initial statement of it. An action's right if it would be permitted by principles that could not reasonably be rejected by people who were moved to find principles for the general regulation of behaviour that others, similarly motivated, could not reasonably reject. Sort of a mouthful. But the important feature that I want to sort of pick up on here, two things. One, that what you're looking for is a kind of set of principles for right action. That's what you're trying to that's what you're seeking. And then he's got this kind of way of adjudicating whether it's the right sort of set of principles that might be such that it can tell you whether an action's right or not. Namely, the sort of thing that could not be reasonably rejected, but not just by anybody, by people who are specifically motivated or specifically kind of engaged in the process of trying to find such a theory of right action. Okay. And so Scanlon sort of famously has kind of particular accounts of, say, formal accounts of what these principles must look like, but more importantly, what sort of things could be grounds for reasonable rejection of principles like this. I'm not going to agree with those, but hopefully it's still going to be in some sense in spirit contractualist. So here's one thing that you might naturally think if you start sort of at the beginning of reading through Scanlon, you don't really know where he's going to end up going with the contractualism. You might think, oh, here's a natural principle for the regulation of behaviour. So to begin with, you might think, oh, principle for the regulation of behaviour, that just sounds like an ethical theory. That's what we want from an ethical theory. What's a natural sort of ethical theory? One that many people have been sort of drawn to in the past is one where what you should be doing is trying to kind of maximize the morally relevant value of the outcomes of the behavior of the action that you're performing. That seems like a natural thing to do. What are we trying to do when we act morally, or how are we, when I'm evaluating your action, not from whether it's kind of the prudentially right thing to do, or the epistemically right thing to do, or aesthetically right thing to do, but whether it's the morally right thing to do. A natural thing to say might be that I'm going to evaluate you for whether what you did maximized the morally relevant value. So a kind of teleological account of what kind of morally right action would be. Seems a natural sort of thing. Okay, but that's going to then require you to give a measure of this morally relevant value. What might that look like? Well, this is where I would suggest your kind of reasonable rejection criteria might come in. You might say, well, whatever value it is that we give to different states of the world, so we're in order to kind of use this general teleological or consequentialist ethical theory that's going to be our principle for the regulation of behavior, we're going to need an account of morally relevant value, and we're going to have to assign, that means we're going to have to assign morally relevant value to each of the states of the world. What should those values look like? Well, they should be an assignment of values that none of the people affected, those people who are engaged in this process of trying to find this ethical theory, that they could reasonably reject. So this is the idea that, yeah, you kind of take Scanlon's original idea that it's a kind of set of principles for the regulation of behavior. You think, well, that looks like an ethical theory. Here's a natural ethical theory. It's one that says that you should do what promotes morally relevant value. And then you use this clause of kind of reasonable rejection in order to narrow down what the potential candidate measures of morally relevant value are. Okay, so what sort of measures of value could an individual reasonably reject? Well, I'm going to claim, and it's sort of, I mean, there's going to be places where I'm just kind of clearly just denying things that Scanlon wants to take, but I'm not, yeah, we can talk about that if people are interested in that. But so one thing I think they couldn't reasonably reject is that the measure of value deviates from their own one. So if you were to present them with the morally relevant values for each of the states of the world, if they were to say, oh, we can't use that because it gives different values to the states of the world than the ones that I give. That seems like not a grounds for reasonable rejection. It's a kind of failure to recognize that this morally relevant value doesn't depend entirely on their levels of welfare or on their preferences. It depends also on this measure of value will have to be in some sense a compromise between their levels of value and others, those of others. But here is one reason that someone might reasonably reject it. They might say, well, look, okay, I accept that it may have to lie some distance from my own evaluation of the value of this state of the world. But if it lies further from my evaluation of it than is necessary in order to effect this compromise between me and the other people in the state of the world, then I would reasonably reject it. If it lies further than is somehow necessary. So it's not entirely clear how to make that precise, but here's one way you might try to make it precise. You've got the state of the world, you've got all of us, say, we've got all our levels of well-being, you've got some single value and you're trying to assign that to the state of the world. Take how far it lies from each of the values that each individual gives and add those up. So there's a kind of total distance from the value that you're thinking of assigning, the candidate value you're thinking of assigning, and each of the values everyone has. So that's a kind of deviation from this candidate value to each of the individual levels of welfare. Alex, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to jump in just with a clarificatory question again. I want to be clear on the question you're asking of individuals. Right? So, of course, it can be how I value a full distribution, but only my place in it, so to speak, my well-being level in it.
Yeah.
Or, and then it's kind of straightforward. It's whatever way you value the distribution. Well, it would be straightforward on a kind of utilitarian view, because the way you value the distribution for me is equivalent to my own assessment of my well-being in that case, right? So the distance would be zero. But of course, suppose that I am an egalitarian. I would say, look, there are two different types of questions. One is, how good is this for me?
Yeah.
And the second is, how good is this whole distribution? And of course, utilitarians, but prioritarians, many others, will say those two things are different. Also, of course, utilitarians would say that in a way, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted more clarity on what you mean by the value that minimizes how far it lies from the assessment of the individuals. Do you mean of the individuals with respect to only their own well-being?
Yeah.
Because individuals also have moral views.
Yeah.
And, or do you mean from the individuals about their value of the full state of the world?
Yeah, so I mean, this is going to come back, and you might prefer the second kind of version of this argument, which is more explicitly distinguishes prudential thinking from moral thinking, and sort of places both of those inside the individual and sort of asks how those two things should relate to one another. But in this case, yes, it's the divergence from this kind of candidate assessment of the whole distribution of welfare from the individual's own assessment of that for themselves, kind of prudentially speaking. Now, you're right, of course, that they have views about the kind of moral, and in some ways, you might think that this is a kind of recipe for them to, this is a kind of normative story about how they should come up with that kind of moral assessment of the whole thing. This is meant to be a story, after all, about what the moral value of the state of the world is, and so this could be a kind of story about. So you leave out of the when you're asking what it's the different distance to, it's the distance to their own assessment of it from their own point of view, and it's that value that minimizes these kind of total distance could be your story about how they should set their moral view of that state of the world. I mean, in fact, I'm saying here it should set just the objective fact about what the moral value of that state of the world is. But that, of course, could just be parsed into a story about that's also how their prudential evaluation, or their evaluation of it purely from their own point of view, should relate to their evaluation of it, kind of morally speaking. I mean, maybe I'll in a second now, in fact, I'll move on to the next one, which I think is kind of might speak to what you're mentioning. So that's the idea that I mean, and maybe one final thing to say is that in some way this is, I mean, a similar problem arises for Scanlon. I think that when he talks about kind of reasonable rejectability, there's this kind of question about what reasonable rejectable. Can you, in the process of reasonably rejecting something, can you, for instance, use the fact that you think it's immoral or something like that, or is it just kind of your own status within it and the complaints that you would have against that becoming the principle? So there's a similar sort of thing he does. Yeah, just
a clarificatory question on
yeah.
So when you say lie further from their assessment than it needs to lie, so that itself is a normative claim. And so are we thinking that is determined by some other kind of antecedent procedure, possibly along contractualist lines as well? And then are we also assuming like uniformity, in that everyone agrees on whether and what it means for an assessment to be further away than it needs to lie?
So this is meant to be a kind of operationalization of that claim. So what does it mean for it to lie further if it didn't minimize how far it lay from this kind of total amount? So this total distance from each of the individuals, then it would lie kind of further than it needs to. You could have got a better one by kind of minimizing, by moving closer, well, by reducing that total distance. Yeah, is that. So this is meant to be, I mean, I think it's not the only way to operationalize this. For instance, another way might be that you should kind of minimize the maximal distance from the candidate to the other individuals. That will give a different sort of account of these things. So this is one particular way of doing it. Okay. I'll just quickly go through this alternative kind of argument, which comes to kind of the same conclusion. So this kind of comes out of R.M. Hare's moral thinking book, where he's kind of trying to argue for utilitarianism on the basis of universalizability of moral judgments. Okay, so I'll just quote this. In fact, then the argument I give may seem in this rather brief presentation of everything to lie quite far from as exegesis from this passage here, but that's because it's kind of been worked through a kind of series of papers that tried to do exegesis and came to a particular anyway. So bear with me. Okay, so here's Hare. I have full knowledge of the other person's preferences. So he's kind of just imagining this situation as this him and this other person, and he's trying. They've both got kind of levels of welfare, or he calls them strengths of preference. And there's this question about how should he act kind of morally in situations that affect the two of them. It says, I have full knowledge of the other person's preferences. And if I do, then I shall acquire preferences equal to his regarding what should be done to me were I in his situation. And these are the preferences which are now conflicting with my original prescriptions. The thought is, in this kind of situation, maybe this choice that he's considering, maybe he's better off than the other person. In one of the kind of two options that he's considering. So he says he's got this particular preference for that option, which is his strength of preference for it. But then he's also got some preference for the situation were he to be in the other person's shoes. And that is the other person's strength of preference or level of welfare. So he's kind of got a value for the actual situation that he's facing and also for this version of it in which he occupies the other role. So we have in effect not an interpersonal conflict of preferences or prescriptions, but an intrapersonal one. Both the conflicting preferences are mine, because he's kind of got both of these preferences there. I shall therefore deal with the conflicts in exactly the same way as between two original preferences of my own. So he thinks you can, and then he thinks that you resolve these by doing some sort of averaging between the two, and he gets utilitarianism out. Okay, there's all sorts of problems with this. There's a kind of gap in it. It's not obvious that it's the same situation that he's got these conflicting preferences with. In fact, it's pretty explicitly not. It's the alternative in which he's occupying the other one. But then he wants to, essentially this whole section, or this whole part of the book, chapter is called Universalizability. What he wants to say is that you ought to have the same attitude, at least in your moral thinking towards those two situations, because your moral judgments should be universalizable. You should be making the same judgment about the situation as you would do were you to be in any of the other cases. Okay, so this is kind of, hopefully speaks a little bit to Alex's question, that he's interested in that book on how you move from prudential thinking to moral thinking. And what should be the kind of differences between the two. So you start off in prudential thinking and you assign a kind of level of value, prudentially relevant level of value to a state of the world. What is it? It's just your level of welfare in that world. But you move to moral thinking, moral evaluation of that situation. And you look at different states of the world in which you take the state of the world you're interested in, and then you kind of consider yourself occupying lots of different, all the different positions within it. And you've got to assign, according to the kind of dictates of moral thinking, the same value to each of those. That's just the universalizability constraint on moral thinking. So you've got to assign that same value. But what is that value going to be? Because it can't, you've got a different level of strength of preference or level of welfare at each of those different situations. You've got your own one at the kind of core one, and then if you're swapped into second position in one of the other ones, you've got that second position's level of welfare there. So you've got all these different conflicting assessments of these states of the world where in each one of them you're occupying different positions in the welfare distribution. But you've got to, by the universalizability claim, give the same assessment to them. So what should you do in that situation? Well, the claim might be there's a sort of principle of minimal mutilation which says something like, well, you should assign the value that lies no further than it needs to from these different values. A kind of natural claim when you're trying to resolve different conflicts about the same situation is to say you should choose something that lies no further than it needs to from all the different possibilities. So I'm just going to speed up now just so we can get a proper chance to kind of talk through things, and I'll just present where I'm getting to with this. So in each of these situations, what we need, Is there-
The
Oh, it's
very
okay.
quick
Yeah, sorry.
question.
Yeah.
On the previous slide, is
Yeah.
pi just supposed to be a bijection of the number?
Sorry, it's a permutation. Yeah, sorry, I should have said that. Yeah, that's right. So you're just thinking of, the state of the world that you were originally thinking of, and then just the one where you're occupying different positions in that case, yeah. Yeah, exactly right, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so what we need in order to kind of do a formal version of this, the sort of apparent conclusion of these two arguments, you need some sort of measure of, well, I'm going to say distance now, then I'll backtrack on that, but distance between levels of welfare or candidate assignments of value to things. I'm just going to assume they lie in a particular real numbered range. And I'm just going to assume that, there's so much you can generalize here, so for simplicity, I'm just going to go with this simple version, but they're going to be real valued distances. You can move into the extended reals, it's fine, but just for simplicity, we're not going to. So I said they're measures of distance. In fact, they're going to be what statisticians call divergences, because we're not going to assume they're symmetric or that they satisfy the triangle inequality. The divergence, all that it says is that the divergence from one level of utility to itself is 0, and from one level of utility to any other one is positive. That's all the constraints on divergence so far. So the thought is that we take those, and then when we want to get the moral value of a state of the world, we're just going to find the value u that minimizes this sum. Minimizes the sum of divergences from u to the first state of the world, from u to the level of well-being of the first individual, second individual, and so on. So that's the idea. So suppose you were to buy those arguments that I've given and that formalization of them, what might you get as a result of this? What's the payoff of doing all of this stuff? So here's a couple of the kind of most commonly used divergences, certainly in kind of information theory, computer tomography, various areas. We might just call the quadratic divergence, which just takes the difference between two numbers and squares them. And then I'm calling this logarithmic. It's probably better name is generalized Kullback-Leibler, that's slightly long-winded, which is, yeah, this divergence, and no reason you should look at that and immediately have an intuition about what that's trying to do. It has a very specific meaning in the probabilistic case. This is a generalization of it out of the probabilistic case. Anyway, these are just illustrations to begin with. So what happens if we use these? Well, it turns out if you use the first one, then you get back from this argument utilitarianism. That's just, in some ways, if you think about this for a little while, that's pretty straightforward. Second one is much less obvious. If you use the logarithmic one, then you get back equally distributed equivalent where your prioritarian function, your strictly increasing concave function that does the skewing is the logarithmic function. Okay, so this makes you have to make some assumptions about what the range is here for this stuff to work. But if you've got those, then what minimizes the what number minimizes total divergence from that number to each of the alternative possible numbers is exactly what the equally distributed equivalent person says if the prioritarian function they're interested in is the logarithmic function. And one way to see this, maybe a natural way, like I was discussing earlier on, is that there's a very natural way to come up with averages from divergences or from distances generally. If you want to take the average of a set of numbers, you might want to say, I'm going to take, I've got a measure of distance, I'm going to take the number that minimizes divergence from that number to each of those numbers. That looks like a kind of natural idea of some sort of average. And that's essentially what's going on here. You give these kind of measures of divergence, they naturally give rise to particular averages. In fact, there's quite a lot, if people are interested, it's pure maths rather than anything philosophical, so there's quite a lot to be said about
Is
these sorts of things.
Q is squared.
That's
It's not
yes,
just the sum.
that's important. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's absolutely right. If you didn't have the squaring, you don't get this at all. You do get a mean, but it's kind of odd. That's for Manhattan distance. Yeah. Okay. So those were just two examples. I think, yeah, in the interest of kind of wrapping up in decent time, I'll just quickly say what the kind of general result is, and then I'll just finish. So those were just two particular examples, but those two particular divergences are instances of a larger class of divergences, which are kind of widely used in, well, definitely in statistics and information theory in particular, but also, yeah, in image reconstruction, tomography, content search, and databases. They're kind of particularly popular. They were kind of devised by this guy Lev Bregman, a Russian mathematician in the 60s, but it's kind of got to about the 90s before statisticians really started kind of like figuring out their properties. Anyway, so again, there's no reason looking at this. You should see what a Bregman divergence is naturally like. It's generated by a particular strictly convex function, phi. How does phi generate it? I'll just say this extremely briefly, so it's not particularly illuminating. If you want to find out the divergence from some number u to some number v, you go to v and take the value of that strictly convex function, you put a tangent on it, and then you look at the difference between the value of the strictly convex function at u and the value of that tangent also at u. No reason you should think, wow, that's a natural way to create a measure of distance. It just turns out it has extraordinarily elegant mathematical properties. I'll say a bit more about why that's not the only reason to like these. But this is the general kind of result that's interesting. So suppose you've got a Bregman divergence like this. It's generated by one of these strictly convex functions. And then suppose you just take your g, which, if you recall from the definition of prioritarianism, was also the variable that I used for the transforming function. You transform welfares by and sum them up to give prioritarian value. If you take your g to be that, then the thing that minimizes this value is exactly what the equally distributed equivalent people want to say the moral value of the thing is. And similarly, you can generate back the other way again if you've got one of these strictly increasing concave and continuous functions. Then you can generate a Bregman divergence that generates the equally distributed equivalent version of it.
Sorry, Richard.
Yes.
Is that a derivative being taken of phi, or what's happening there?
Yes, a derivative of phi, that's right. Yeah. So take your strictly convex one, take its derivative, that will be your g, that will give you this. Now, this doesn't in itself guarantee that g's concave. You still have to kind of put some constraints on it. Indeed, you can, they needn't be concave. This could indeed be the quadratic function, and that would give you the utilitarian thing. But you can then place further constraints on those phi. You can put constraints on the distance measures in order to kind of give the precise one that gives utilitarianism, just by saying that the distance measure is in fact symmetric. Or you can give rise to all the prioritarian ones by saying that the distance measure is asymmetric in this particular way, that moving from a lower number to a higher number is a smaller distance than moving from that same higher number back to the lower number. Okay, so I've kind of gone over what I said I would do, which was 45 minutes. So I'll stop there, but there's more. I mean, one thing that I have as extras if people are interested in is an argument for why Bregman divergences are the right thing to do in the first place. This is not at all the first time they've been used in welfare kind of ethics. But they're used by the duo that I was going to cite, which is Magdalou and Nock. They're interested in using them to measure distance to measure measures of inequality. So what they want to do is take a distribution of welfare and say how unequal it is. And their measure of how unequal it is its divergence from that distribution to the nearest equal distribution. So there's a kind of different motivation, but in any case. But there's kind of curious things to say about there. So I'm just kind of citing their axiomatization of the Bregman divergences. What's kind of interesting about them is that a lot of them look sort of egalitarianly motivated. And then they give the Bregman divergences, but then if you plug them into this kind of framework, they don't give anything like egalitarianism. They give either utilitarianism or this version of prioritarianism, the equally distributed equivalent. Anyway, so if people are interested, I can kind of talk through that representation theorem that's not my own, it's theirs. But the kind of general lesson is that if you use this approach and take morally relevant value to be this kind of value that minimizes distance, total distance from the value to the different levels of welfare that individuals have at the state of the world, then you end up getting back either utilitarianism or this equally distributed equivalent version of prioritarianism. And then you can kind of, place constraints on the distance measures that allow you to tell between those different things. So it's a kind of alternative. I'm not going to make any claims that it's superior to the standard way of arguing for prioritarianism, but it's a kind of alternative that might be complementary to it. Anyway, I'll finish there. Thanks very much.